Slavery ended more than a century ago, but its voice never went silent. It whispers in laws, echoes in institutions, and shouts in the daily lives of millions. Racism today is not a new invention. It is the language slavery taught the world, and we still speak it. Imagine this: a child in 1850 is sold on an auction block, her worth measured in dollars, her humanity erased. Now imagine a child today, stopped and questioned by police, judged not by who she is, but by the color of her skin. The settings are different, the chains have changed. But the logic that some lives are less valuable than others remains frighteningly familiar. This video will take you beyond the history books. We'll follow the thread from the slave ships to segregation, from Jim Crow to mass incarceration, from plantation fields to unequal classrooms and neighborhoods today. We'll reveal how slavery built more than economies. It built systems of power, fear, and prejudice that still shape society. If you think slavery is over, prepare to see the shadows it cast across centuries. Because the truth is unsettling, the past is not past. It lives in us, and in the language we still use to divide, control, and oppress. Welcome to slavery's dark past. Slavery did not simply end in 1865 with the stroke of a pen. It left behind more than scars. It left behind an entire worldview. A system of thought, a language of hierarchy, a way of classifying human beings by race that still lingers today. When we look at racism in the 21st century, in schools, in neighborhoods, in prisons, in everyday conversations, we are not looking at something new. We are looking at slavery's echo, a continuation of the same logic that once allowed millions to be bought and sold like cattle. This video asks a haunting question: why does racism today still sound like slavery speaking through time? To answer, we must trace the thread from the past to the present, from the hold of slave ships to the rhetoric of politicians, from auction blocks to corporate boardrooms, from overseers to police patrols. The story we are about to tell is not easy. It is filled with violence, loss, and cruelty. But it is also filled with resilience, survival, and the fight for dignity. Only by facing the darkness of the past can we understand the shadows it casts today. Slavery was more than chains, whips, and auction blocks. It was an idea. For one human being to own another, there had to be a story, a justification, that made it possible. That story became the language of slavery, and it still echoes today. 1. Dehumanization. The first step in making slavery possible was erasing humanity. Enslaved men and women were renamed, stripped of identity, and reduced to labels like hands, breeding stock, or simply property. In ledgers, a 12-year-old child could appear next to horses and wagons, valued by weight and teeth. When people are turned into objects, cruelty becomes easier. Whipping, selling, and separating families could be explained away as business. Even now, traces of this survive in stereotypes that treat black people as less human, less feeling, or less worthy. 2. Pseudoscience. As slavery expanded, so did the need for intellectual defense. Enter scientific racism. In the 18th and 19th centuries, scholars measured skulls and weighed brains, declaring Africans inferior. Doctors claimed black people felt less pain, justifying brutal treatment. These lies gave slavery the appearance of fact. They turned prejudice into science, and though discredited, their shadow lingers in modern medicine and criminal justice, where black patients' pain is still underestimated, and black defendants still judged as more dangerous. 3. Religion as a weapon. Religion, too, was bent to slavery's service. Slaveholders quoted verses about obedience, preaching that bondage was God's will. Enslaved people were forced to listen, as ministers told them, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters." But in secret, the enslaved reclaimed faith. In hushed gatherings, they sang songs of freedom. "Go down, Moses." They prayed not for obedience, but for liberation. Religion became both a chain and a key, twisted by oppressors, reclaimed by the oppressed. 4. Stories and fear. Culture carried slavery's message. Newspapers, minstrel shows, and popular tales portrayed black people as happy servants, natural workers, or dangerous rebels. These stories comforted those who wanted slavery to continue and terrified those who feared its end. Fear was especially powerful. After uprisings like Nat Turner's rebellion, violence against black communities spread like wildfire. The lesson was clear: resistance would be punished with terror. That same narrative, that black resistance equals chaos, still echoes in modern debates about protest and order. 5. Why it still matters. Slavery needed more than chains, it needed words. Words turn people into property, lies into science, faith into obedience, and fear into law. That language did not vanish with emancipation. It seeped into laws, stereotypes, and systems that outlived slavery itself. When we hear black students described as less capable, or black victims labeled thugs, we are not hearing new words. We are hearing slavery's dictionary, still in use. Slavery's legal end in 1865 is often remembered as a victory, the moment when freedom was secured. But for millions of newly freed men, women, and children, emancipation was not the end of bondage. It was the beginning of a new chapter in slavery's language. The chains were gone, but the words, the logic that justified oppression adapted, reshaping themselves into laws, customs, and violence. 1. The Black Codes, slavery by another name. In the years after the Civil War, Southern states wrote new laws, known as the Black Codes. These laws were designed to control freed people and keep them tied to white landowners. Freedmen were forbidden from voting, from testifying against whites in court, from gathering without permission. If a black man was found without a labor contract, he could be arrested for vagrancy. Once arrested, he could be leased to plantations, railroads, or mines in a system called convict leasing. Convict leasing was slavery reborn. Entire generations were funneled from freedom into prisons, their labor sold to the highest bidder. The language was different, but the message was the same. Black bodies still belonged to someone else. 2. Jim Crow and segregation. By the late 19th century, separate but equal became the law of the land. Jim Crow laws spread across the South, mandating segregated schools, restaurants, buses, and even cemeteries. The phrase equal was a cruel joke. Black schools were starved of funding, neighborhoods were left without resources, and jobs were closed off to anyone deemed unfit. The same vocabulary slavery had created, lazy, inferior, dangerous, underpinned these laws. Every segregated drinking fountain, every whites-only sign, every separate seat on a bus was a sentence in slavery's ongoing language. 3. Racial violence and terror. Where laws were not enough, violence spoke louder. Between the 1880s and the 1950s, thousands of black men, women, and children were lynched in public spectacles. Lynchings were not only killings, they were messages. Crowds gathered as if for a carnival, sometimes taking photographs of the body as souvenirs. The message was simple: freedom has limits. The ideology of slavery lived on in every rope and burning cross. It declared, "You may no longer be slaves by law, but we still decide if you live or die." 4. The North was not innocent. It's easy to think this language was confined to the South, but the North had its own chains. When black families migrated to cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York, they faced housing discrimination, exclusion from unions, and racist policing. Banks drew red lines on maps, refusing loans to black neighborhoods. White mobs attacked black communities that dared to prosper, like Tulsa's Greenwood District, destroyed in 1921. Jim Crow may have been Southern law, but racism was America's law. And everywhere, the unspoken words of slavery lingered: "You are not equal, you do not belong." 5. The continuity of control. From the Black Codes to Jim Crow to redlining, one theme connects them all: control. Slavery had always been about power, the power to define someone's worth, to dictate their place, to profit from their labor. Even after emancipation, society never abandoned this logic. It simply replaced whips with laws, chains with policies, and overseers with police. The system had changed its shape, but not its soul. Closing transition. Slavery was declared dead, but its ghost lingered in the law, in the soil, in the air. The language of control survived, whispered in courtrooms, carved into segregation signs, shouted in mob violence. And as the 20th century dawned, this language of slavery would adapt once again, finding new life in the very institutions that claimed to serve and protect. That is the story of the next chapter: how slavery's vocabulary became embedded in policing, prisons, housing, and education, the very systems we live with today. The Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery on paper. The 13th Amendment declared it unconstitutional, with one exception: except as punishment for a crime. That single clause became the gateway for slavery's language to survive in new institutions. Slavery had built not just an economy, but an entire way of organizing society. When the old system collapsed, its ghost moved into new homes, prisons, police forces, housing laws, schools. Each of these institutions carried forward the same logic that black lives could be controlled, exploited, and confined. 1. Policing, from slave patrols to modern forces. The first formal police forces in the American South were not created to fight crime, they were created to control enslaved people. Slave patrols rode through plantations, hunting runaways, crushing resistance, and enforcing obedience. After slavery, those patrols evolved into municipal police. Their mission barely shifted. They still patrolled black communities, still enforced racial hierarchies, still acted as the front line of control. In the 20th century, as segregation weakened, policing grew harsher. The war on drugs disproportionately targeted black neighborhoods. Arrests soared. Black men became the most incarcerated group on earth. The chain had been replaced with handcuffs, the overseer with the officer. But the language, control, suspicion, violence remained the same. 2. Prisons, the new plantation, the 13th Amendment's exception, slavery as punishment for crime, opened the door for convict leasing. Freed black men, arrested under vague charges like vagrancy, were leased to railroads, mines, and farms. They were whipped, starved, and worked to death in conditions often worse than slavery. This system never disappeared, it transformed. Today, mass incarceration has become its heir. With over 2 million people behind bars, disproportionately black, the prison has replaced the plantation as a site of extraction. Companies profit from prison labor, paying cents per hour. The words have changed, but the meaning is clear. The labor of black bodies is still treated as cheap, disposable, and owned. 3. Housing, redlines, and invisible chains. Slavery kept black people in physical bondage. After emancipation, new systems confined them in space. In the 20th century, the federal government drew red lines around black neighborhoods, refusing to insure mortgages there. Banks denied loans, white neighborhoods enforced racial covenants that banned black families from buying property. The result was a manufactured wealth gap. White families accumulated property and passed it down through generations. Black families were locked out of ownership, trapped in underfunded neighborhoods. The message was the same as slavery: this land is not yours, your place is fixed. 4. Education, knowledge as power, knowledge as denial. During slavery, it was often illegal to teach the enslaved to read. Knowledge was dangerous. It could inspire rebellion, fuel escape, spread hope. After emancipation, schools for black children were deliberately underfunded. Teachers worked with broken supplies, overcrowded classrooms, and meager pay. Even today, schools in predominantly black neighborhoods receive far less funding than those in wealthy white areas. The old logic persists: if education empowers, then denying it keeps power intact. The language of slavery whispers through every crumbling school building and every missing textbook. 5. The disguise of neutrality. What makes these institutional echoes so dangerous is their disguise. Unlike slavery, they no longer announce themselves openly. They claim neutrality, law and order, zoning laws, funding formulas. But the outcomes are the same: confinement, inequality, exclusion. Neutral words mask an old vocabulary, one first written on slave ships and plantations. Closing transition. The ghost of slavery lives in these institutions. In police patrols echoing overseers, in prison labor replacing plantation fields. In housing policies that cage families in invisible lines. In schools that deny opportunity as surely as chains once denied freedom. Slavery did not vanish, it changed its costume. And to this day, the systems that shape our lives still speak its language, quietly, bureaucratically, but unmistakably. Next, we turn to how this language also survives in culture, in the stereotypes, stories, and images that slavery created, and how they still shape how we see each other today. Slavery's words did not die with slavery itself. They slipped quietly into new conversations, new policies, new stereotypes. What began as a brutal vocabulary of control and dehumanization became the grammar of racism, a way of speaking about, seeing, and treating black people that endures even now. Racism today is not separate from slavery. It is slavery's dialect, still spoken in law, in media, and in daily life. 1. Stereotypes that survived the whip. Slavery invented stereotypes to make oppression feel justified. The lazy slave explained why forced labor was necessary. The brutish black man excused violence and lynching. The mammy caricature reassured white families that black women were happy as caretakers. These stereotypes never disappeared, they adapted. In the 20th century, film and television recycled them: the clownish minstrel, the violent criminal, the over-sexualized black woman. Even today, echoes remain. A black man in a hoodie is suspicious. A black woman speaking firmly is angry. Black children are often seen as older and less innocent than their peers. The words have shifted, but the story is unchanged. Black humanity is questioned, reduced, or distorted. 2. The myth of colorblindness. Modern racism often hides behind neutrality. Laws and institutions claim to be colorblind, treating everyone equally, but the outcomes tell another story. Standardized tests, voter ID laws, mandatory sentencing, or housing regulations are written without racial labels. Yet their impact falls hardest on black communities. This is slavery's language in disguise, rules that appear neutral but carry centuries of bias built into their results. It is the same old sentence written in invisible ink: you are still less. 3. The media as an echo chamber. In slavery's time, newspapers and posters reinforced dehumanization. Today, mass media often does the same. Crime reporting, for instance, disproportionately highlights black suspects while downplaying crimes committed by whites. Headlines describe black victims as thugs, but white perpetrators as troubled young men. Television, film, and music also recycle stereotypes. The criminal, the athlete, the comic relief, narrow roles inherited from centuries of caricature. Each repetition reinforces the same grammar slavery taught, that black identity is confined, simplified, and controlled. For everyday speech, the microlanguage of racism. Beyond laws and media, the language of slavery seeps into everyday interactions. Comments like "you're so articulate" suggest surprise and intelligence. Job applications with ethnic-sounding names get fewer callbacks. Teachers may discipline black students more harshly than white students for the same behavior. These are not whips or chains. They are words and assumptions, small, constant reminders that slavery's voice still whispers. 5. Why language is power. Language shapes reality. If a people are described as dangerous, laws will target them. If they are described as inferior, schools will neglect them. If they are described as criminals, prisons will overflow with them. Slavery's greatest invention was not only the whip or the auction block. It was this language, words that turned oppression into common sense. That language has been passed down, repackaged, and spoken anew in each generation. Closing transition. Racism today is not a relic of the past, it is the past speaking through us. It is slavery's old grammar dressed in new vocabulary. But just as language can oppress, it can also resist. The enslaved once sang songs of freedom in hushed voices. Their descendants raised voices in protest, music, and art. The counter-language of resistance has always existed, and it is to that story we now turn. If slavery created a language of control, the enslaved and their descendants created a counter-language of survival, defiance, and freedom. Every system of oppression produces resistance, and in the face of whips, chains, and silence, black communities found ways to speak back. This resistance was not always written in books or shouted in speeches. Sometimes it was hidden in songs, whispered in prayers, or carved into secret acts of defiance. Yet together, these voices formed a powerful reply: we are human, we will not be silenced. 1. Spirituals and secret songs. In the fields and cabins of plantations, enslaved people sang. On the surface, the songs were about faith: swing low, sweet chariot, or go down, Moses. But beneath the surface, they carried hidden meanings. A line about crossing the Jordan could signal escape across a river. A verse about Moses was a coded call for liberation. These spirituals were more than music. They were maps, prayers, and protests wrapped in melody. To the enslaved, they were survival. To the oppressor, they were invisible, a secret language spoken in plain sight. 2. To folklore and storytelling. When literacy was forbidden, oral tradition became the library. Folk tales like those of Brer Rabbit carried deep lessons, the weak outsmarting the strong, the powerless finding ways to resist. On the surface, these were children's stories. But to those who listened closely, they were allegories of survival, reminders that wit and cunning could outmaneuver brute force. The stories said, what could not be spoken openly, the master is not invincible. 3. Religion reclaimed. Though oppressors used religion to preach obedience, enslaved people reclaimed it as a source of strength. In secret hush harbors, they prayed for freedom and drew strength from stories of deliverance. Moses, Daniel, and Jesus became symbols of survival against impossible odds. Religion became a tool of counter-language, where the enslaver's Bible said obey, the enslaved read resist. For everyday acts of defiance, not all resistance was dramatic. Sometimes it was in slowing down work, breaking tools, or pretending not to understand orders. Sometimes it was in teaching a child to read in secret, or keeping alive African traditions in music, cooking, and dance. Each small act was a way of saying, "You do not control all of me." 5. The civil rights counter-language. Centuries later, during the civil rights movement, this counter-language erupted into public life. The songs of the fields became protest anthems, "We shall overcome." The secret prayers of the enslaved became fiery sermons from pulpits. Folklore became literature, from Zora Neale Hurston to James Baldwin. Activists spoke in a language that flipped slavery's script. Where slavery said inferior, they declared equal. Where slavery said silent, they shouted freedom now. This was not just politics, it was a centuries-long conversation between the oppressed and their oppressors. 6. Modern voices. Today, music, literature, and art continue this tradition. Hip-hop, for instance, often acts as a counter-narrative, exposing inequality, reclaiming identity, and speaking truth to power. Writers and filmmakers dismantle stereotypes created during slavery, replacing them with complex, authentic portrayals. This cultural resistance shows that slavery's language may still echo, but it does not go unchallenged. Closing transition. For every word slavery invented to dehumanize, resistance created another to affirm life. For every stereotype, a song. For every law, a story. For every whip, a prayer. The struggle between these two languages, oppression and resistance, continues today, and it is not just an American story. Across the world, slavery left its marks, shaping societies far beyond U.S. borders. That is the next chapter, the global echoes of slavery's language. Slavery was not only America's tragedy. It was a global system, spanning continents, shaping empires, and leaving scars across the world. To see slavery only through the lens of the United States is to miss the full scale of its shadow. The language of slavery, the dehumanization, the stereotypes, the systems of control, spread far beyond one nation's borders. From Brazil to the Caribbean, from Europe to Africa itself, slavery carved wounds that still bleed into the present. 1. Brazil, the largest slave society. While the United States imported around 400,000 enslaved Africans, Brazil received over 4 million, more than 10 times as many. By the 19th century, Brazil had become the largest slave society in the world. On sugar plantations and in the mines, enslaved people endured brutal conditions. Mortality rates were so high that planters often found it cheaper to import new slaves than to keep the existing ones alive. Brazil abolished slavery only in 1888, the last country in the Americas to do so. Yet even today, Brazil's racial inequalities are stark. Afro-Brazilians make up the majority of the poor and imprisoned, while whiteness remains tied to privilege. The language of slavery, inequality, exploitation, exclusion, still whispers through Brazilian society. 2. The Caribbean, sugar and chains. The Caribbean islands were engines of the transatlantic slave trade. Sugar was white gold, and enslaved Africans were the fuel. Plantations in Jamaica, Barbados, and Haiti consumed lives at staggering rates. But the Caribbean also produced some of the most powerful rebellions. In 1791, enslaved Haitians rose up, defeating Napoleon's armies and creating the first Black Republic. Haiti's revolution terrified slave-holding nations, proving that slavery could be overturned. Yet the punishment was severe. France demanded Haiti pay reparations to former slaveholders, a debt that crippled the nation for over a century. Even freedom carried chains. 3. Africa, the wounded homeland. Africa was not only the source of enslaved people, it was also devastated by the trade itself. Villages were raided, kingdoms destabilized, and entire regions depopulated. The language of slavery reshaped Africa's image in the global imagination. Africans were portrayed as primitive, savage, in need of European civilization. These lies later fueled colonialism, which carved up the continent for European empires. The wound was twofold: millions taken away, and those left behind trapped in poverty and foreign domination. For Europe, the profiteers, though slavery rarely existed on European soil, European nations built their wealth on its profits. British ships carried enslaved Africans, French plantations thrived on Caribbean sugar. Portuguese traders dominated the Atlantic routes. The great cities of Europe, London, Liverpool, Lisbon, Bordeaux, grew rich on human suffering. Banks, universities, and even churches accumulated wealth tied directly to slavery. Even today, statues and buildings across Europe stand as silent reminders of fortunes built on chains. The language of slavery is not just American, it is European, global, and ongoing. 5. Modern slavery and its shadows. The legal slavery has ended. Forms of exploitation persist worldwide: human trafficking, forced labor, child exploitation. The echoes of the old system shape these modern crimes, where marginalized people, often migrants or the poor, are treated as disposable. At the same time, racial hierarchies born of slavery continue to define global inequalities. Colorism, anti-black racism, and systemic exclusion can be traced back to centuries of slavery's vocabulary. Closing transition. Slavery's past was never local, it was global. Its chains stretched across oceans, binding continents together in a web of profit and pain. Its language of dehumanization spread through every empire, every colony, every nation touched by the trade. And because its reach was global, so too are its echoes. From Brazil's favelas to Caribbean debt, from Africa's wounds to Europe's wealth, slavery's voice still speaks. Next, we ask the crucial question: why does it matter today? Why should we still listen to echoes of a system that ended over a century ago? The answer lies in what happens when we refuse to remember. Some people ask, why talk about slavery now? Isn't it over? On paper, yes, slavery was abolished more than a century ago. But its echoes are everywhere. To ignore them is to misunderstand the world we live in. Slavery is not ancient history. It is recent, living memory, and its language continues to shape lives today. 1. The cost of forgetting. When societies try to bury their past, the wounds do not heal, they deepen. After emancipation, instead of reckoning with slavery's horrors, many nations chose silence. Textbooks minimized it, statues glorified enslavers. Generations grew up believing slavery was a necessary evil or simply an economic system, rather than a crime against humanity. This silence is dangerous. It allows old lies to resurface, dressed as new ideas. If slavery's dehumanizing language is not confronted, it keeps whispering in politics, media, and everyday life. 2. Systemic racism as a living legacy. Look at the world today. Black families in the U.S. hold 1/10 the wealth of white families. Black Americans are more likely to be imprisoned, more likely to die in childbirth, and more likely to attend underfunded schools. In Brazil, Afro-Brazilians face higher poverty rates and disproportionate police violence. Across Europe, migrants of African descent are more likely to face discrimination in housing and employment. These are not coincidences, they are the long shadow of slavery, the same logic of inequality, reshaped into modern systems. The auction block became the wage gap. The overseer became the officer, the plantation became the prison. 3. Cultural memory and stereotypes. Slavery's vocabulary is still spoken in subtle ways. The jokes that rely on stereotypes, the films that recycle caricatures, the headlines that criminalize victims, even language itself carries the echo. Words like master bedroom, grandfather clause, or plantation tour often go unexamined, their roots in slavery forgotten. When we fail to question the language we use, we risk carrying slavery's worldview into the present without realizing it. For why confronting history heals, confronting slavery's legacy is not about guilt. It is about truth. Without truth, there can be no justice. Without justice, there can be no healing. Other nations have shown what this can look like. In South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission forced a reckoning with apartheid. In Germany, memorials and education about the Holocaust ensure the crimes of the past are never minimized. But in places shaped by slavery, reckoning has been slower. Statues still stand, textbooks still soften, and denial still lingers. To heal, we must do more than remember. We must speak the truth openly and let it reshape our future. 5. The language of change. If slavery's words are still spoken, then so too must resistance speak. Every protest chant, every book, every song that challenges racism adds to the counter-language of freedom. When we say Black Lives Matter, it is not just a slogan. It is a direct rebuttal to slavery's dictionary, which for centuries declared that Black lives did not. This is why remembering slavery matters, because the fight against racism today is part of the same long conversation. The past is not past, it is present, and it is speaking. Closing transition. To ignore slavery is to misunderstand racism. To dismiss its echoes is to let them continue unchallenged. Slavery is not simply a chapter in history, it is a thread that runs through our societies, our institutions, and our words. And so, in our final chapter, we bring the story full circle. We ask, what does it mean to live in a world where slavery's voice still whispers, and what will it take to silence it for good? Slavery was declared dead more than a century ago. The chains were broken, the auctions ended, the plantations emptied. But slavery was never just a system of labor, it was a system of thought, a language of control and dehumanization. And that language did not die. It survived, it adapted, it found new voices in laws, stereotypes, institutions, and even in the silence of forgetting. Today, racism is slavery's echo, the same words spoken in different accents, the same story told with different characters. 1. The unbroken thread. From the auction block to the prison cell, from the overseer's whip to the officer's baton, from segregation signs to redlined maps, the logic has remained consistent. Some lives matter less. This is the unbroken thread. When we see inequality in schools, in wages, in neighborhoods, we are not witnessing accidents of history. We are witnessing slavery's vocabulary, still spoken by our systems. 2. The battle of languages. History is a conversation between two voices, oppression and resistance. Slavery spoke the language of chains, but the enslaved answered with the language of songs. Segregation spoke the language of silence, but the civil rights movement replied with shouts of freedom. And today, when systemic racism whispers through laws and stereotypes, the counter-language of protest rises again. Every march, every chant, every work of art that asserts dignity is part of this centuries-long dialogue. The question is, which language will we choose to carry forward? 3. The danger of denial. The greatest danger is to believe slavery is gone, that its echoes no longer matter. Denial is itself a language, one that says, the past is irrelevant. The present needs no context, inequality is natural. But denial does not erase history, it only guarantees repetition. To silence slavery's echo, we must first admit we still hear it. For a call to memory, memory is power. To remember truthfully is to disarm the lies that sustain oppression. That is why this history matters, not to dwell in guilt, but to confront reality. When we name slavery's influence in our systems, we weaken its hold. When we tell the stories of those who resisted, we continue their fight. When we speak openly about the echoes, we begin to change the language itself. 5. Closing reflection. Slavery ended. But its voice still lingers. It whispers in laws, shouts in inequality, and hums beneath the surface of everyday life. Yet history also leaves us another voice, the voice of survival, of song, of protest. The language of freedom that generations fought to keep alive. The choice is ours. We can continue to speak slavery's language, or we can choose the counter-language of resistance and truth. Because the past is not past, it is present. And until we confront it, slavery will never be silent. Final words to the viewer. This has been Slavery's Dark Past. If this history moved you, share it, discuss it, and let it spark conversations. The echoes of slavery are all around us. The question is, will we keep repeating them, or finally learn to speak a new language?